The Type 59 radar operator tightened his headset and slowly swept his screen across the darkness north of Hanoi. It was September 1972. He had been tracking American aircraft for 3 years, and their habits were now familiar. B-52s arrived in formations, huge, unmistakable radar returns visible from nearly 70 kilometers away. Four Phantoms escorted them, their afterburners burning bright, leaving infrared signatures that led missile crews directly to their targets. The system was proven. More than 200 American aircraft had already been destroyed by the Soviet-designed Integrated Air Defense Network, protecting North Vietnam. Behind him, the station commander stood with folded arms, eyes fixed on a glowing green display. Any contacts? Clear airspace, Comrade Major. Nothing in range. The commander gave a brief nod. Their sight guarded the northeastern approach to the capital, arguably the most heavily protected airspace on the planet. 32 radar stations operated together, feeding targeting information to nearly 200 surface-to-air missile batteries. Above 10,000 feet, no patch of sky was uncovered. American pilots called it the Ring of Steel. Soviet advisors preferred a simpler word, impenetrable. 3 kilometers to the west, an SA-2 missile battery completed its evening procedures. 6 missiles stood ready, angled toward the sky, each carrying a 195-kilogram warhead capable of obliterating anything within a 30-meter blast radius. The battery commander had personally supervised the day's radar calibration. His system could track a lone fighter at 40 kilometers and even distinguish between an F-4 and an F-105 based solely on radar cross-section. Fire control radar operational, reported the technician. All missiles were armed and ready. Moments later, the infrared detection unit checked in. Their newest Soviet sensors could pick up jet exhaust heat from 25 kilometers away, an essential safeguard against American aircraft attempting to slip below radar coverage. The operator studied his thermal display with disciplined focus. No movement, no heat signatures. Deep underground, inside a reinforced command bunker, the air defense coordinator examined the master plotting board, where the entire battlespace was reduced to symbols and glowing lines, silent waiting. Every radar post, missile battery, and anti-aircraft gun position glowed green on the status board. Operational. Ready. The Americans would strike tonight. Clear weather always brought them, and his integrated air defense system would detect them the instant they crossed into North Vietnamese airspace. He had addressed his crews that morning. The Americans have technology, he told them. Electronic countermeasures, chaff, jamming pods, yes. But radar obeys physics. Metal reflects electromagnetic waves. Laws of nature do not bargain. You cannot conceal a 10-ton aircraft flying 600 kilometers an hour at 20,000 feet. It cannot be done. His deputy agreed. They had analyzed 4 years of American penetration attempts, and the conclusions were unmistakable. High-altitude bombers produced enormous radar signatures. Low-level attackers revealed themselves through infrared heat. The entire defense network was layered with overlapping coverage, deliberately engineered to erase blind spots. The Type 59 operator completed another sweep. The screen remained clear. He logged the time. 2,147 hours. Clear conditions. No contacts. His commander stepped out to inspect the other stations. 60 kilometers to the north. Something slipped through the night. No radar return. No infrared flare. No engine noise carried above the jungle canopy. The operator's display stayed empty, showing only faint ground clutter he had learned to ignore years earlier. Then, at 2,203 hours, the fuel depot at Yen Vien erupted in flames. Seconds later, the railway switching yard detonated. Then the petroleum storage facility. 3 critical targets. 3 direct strikes. 16 seconds apart. The radar operator froze, hands locked on the controls, staring at a screen that showed nothing at all. His commander burst back into the room, shouting into the radio network. All stations report. Who had the contact? Who tracked the aircraft? One by one, the replies came back identical. No radar detection. No infrared trace. No visual sighting. The operator felt his hands begin to tremble. There had been nothing on his scope, nothing in the sky, yet 3 hardened installations had been hit with pinpoint accuracy. A defense network worth billions of rubles had failed to detect a single intruder. Physics, he had been told, does not negotiate. The morning damage assessment only deepened the nightmare. American munitions had punched through the reinforced concrete roof of the North Vietnamese fuel depot, precision strikes delivered through ventilation shafts. Such hits demanded exact coordinates and unobstructed visual acquisition. At the railway switching yard, the control building had been destroyed by a single weapon that entered through an eastern-facing window. The navigation required was extraordinary. The accuracy defied explanation. Accomplishing this without lingering over the target area should have been impossible. Yet, 23 separate radar stations had logged nothing. The air defense coordinator stood amid the smoldering wreckage of the fuel depot, a Soviet technical manual clutched in his hand. He had spent the entire night cross-checking its contents, detection thresholds, operating frequencies, calibration limits. The Type 59 radar operated between 2.695 and 2.75 gigahertz, bands deliberately selected because American aircraft were unable to absorb or scatter those frequencies. The physics was simple. Any metallic surface larger than half the radar wavelength would generate a measurable return. An F-4 phantom presented a radar cross-section of roughly 5 square meters. A B-52 exceeded 20. Such aircraft could not simply vanish. His deputy approached, holding the report from the infrared detection unit. "Comrade Colonel, the sensors detected nothing, not even residual heat after the detonations. Check the systems again. They've been checked 3 times. All equipment is functioning normally." The coordinator slowly circled the blast craters surrounding the depot. Impact geometry indicated weapons released from medium altitude, between 15 and 20,000 feet, according to forensic analysis. But operating at that height meant prolonged exposure. His essay: 2 missiles required only 45 seconds to reach intercept range. The attacking aircraft should have been vulnerable for at least 2 full minutes during their approach and attack run. A radio operator hurried across the debris. "Colonel, Hanoi sector reports the same occurrence last night. The Bat Jong radio relay station was destroyed at 20:56 hours. No radar detection. 13 minutes before our strike." He thought, "Yes, sir. They're requesting any tracking data we might have." The coordinator had no data to provide. His files contained empty radar logs, shaken operators, and 3 smoking impact sites where critical infrastructure had stood only 8 hours earlier. By midday, the situation worsened. Reports continued to arrive. The bridge at Tan Hoa had been struck, no radar detection. An ammunition storage site had been destroyed by a direct hit, no infrared trace. In Hanoi, the Pattern Analysis Center assembled eyewitness accounts from across the region. 17 separate observers reported hearing explosions. Not a single one reported seeing aircraft, contrails, or any movement in the sky. The commander of a missile battery arrived, carrying his engagement calculations. "Colonel, I've rerun the numbers assuming they're using an advanced jamming system. Even if they're deceiving our radar with false returns, the infrared station should register engine heat. If they're flying beneath radar coverage, the acoustic sensors should still detect them." He spread his charts across the hood of a truck. "I cannot generate a firing solution against a target that does not appear in any spectrum." That evening, a Soviet technical advisor arrived from Hanoi. He carried classified briefing folders and wore the insignia of the GRU, military intelligence. The coordinator met him inside the underground command bunker. "Your report states 0 radar cross-section." The advisor said, "Yes, across all frequencies." "And no infrared signature?" "Correct." The Soviet advisor opened his briefcase and removed a physics textbook. "This is not merely unlikely," he said. "It is impossible. Do you understand? Radar cross-section cannot be eliminated, only reduced through shaping. And even the most refined shape still reflects something." He tapped the open page. "The Americans do not possess this capability. No one does." The coordinator gestured toward the bunker entrance, toward the distant horizon where smoke still rose from the ruins. "Then what attacked us?" The Soviet advisor slowly closed the book. He had no explanation. Within 48 hours, Moscow ordered a comprehensive technical inquiry. 6 experts from the Radio Electronics Institute were dispatched, along with 3 radar engineers from the PVO Stranier Defense Command and 2 physicists from the Ministry of Defense's Research Directorate. They arrived in Hanoi carrying 8 crates of diagnostic instruments and complete certainty that the North Vietnamese crews had miscalibrated their systems. The investigation was led by Colonel Dmitry Volkov. He established his analysis station inside the primary radar complex. Volkov had personally designed components of the SA-2 missile guidance system. With 3 decades of experience in radar engineering, he understood precisely how electromagnetic radiation behaved. Run full self-diagnostics. He instructed the Vietnamese operators. All stations complete spectrum sweeps. The results returned flawless. Every radar site was operating squarely within prescribed specifications. Volkov then ordered live tests of the Type 59 systems against known targets. MiG fighters conducted calibration flights at multiple altitudes. Each aircraft was tracked without error. Range, altitude, and velocity displayed with precision. Your equipment is functioning properly, Volkov conceded. So we moved on to reconstructing the attacks. His team rebuilt the September strikes using crater geometry, bomb fragment analysis, and impact timing. The findings were unsettling. The weapons used were standard American Mk, 84 2,000-pound bombs. Nothing experimental, nothing unfamiliar. Impact angles indicated release altitudes between 12 and 18,000 feet. Attack vectors approached from different directions, implying either several aircraft or a single platform executing multiple attack runs. Multiple passes, Volkov muttered, studying the plotted data, which means loitering, reduced speed, maximum radar exposure. He turned to his deputy. What's the shortest time between these strikes? Bakjong and Yen Veen, 17 minutes apart. Distance, 112 kilometers. Volkov ran the numbers himself. Subsonic velocities, 600, perhaps 700 kilometers per hour at most. He marked the strike locations on his map. Slow-moving aircraft, operating at medium altitude, flying straight attack paths. This should have been the simplest interception case imaginable. Yet the theory collapsed when compared against the radar records. 23 separate sites had logged nothing at all. No fleeting returns, no anomalies, no unexplained clutter. Just empty sky where aircraft should have been. The Soviet physicists suggested alternative possibilities. Perhaps the Americans had achieved plasma stealth, an ionized gas envelope around the aircraft that absorbed radar energy. Volkov's team installed additional ionization sensors. During the next attack, which destroyed a petroleum facility near Haiphong, the instruments registered nothing out of the ordinary. No radar detection. No ionization trace. Another hypothesis followed. Orbital weapons platforms. Precision-guided bombs released from satellites, accounting for the absence of aircraft signatures. Mathematicians ran the orbital calculations. The idea was dismissed. Satellites could not loiter over a target, could not alter aim during descent, and could not deliver the documented accuracy from orbital heights. A third theory emerged: submarine-launched cruise missiles. The Navy deployed extra coastal sensors. They detected no submarine activity, no missile launches, and more importantly, the attack geometry did not match cruise missile profiles. The weapons descended from altitude, not from sea-level approaches. By November, Volkov had ruled out every conventional explanation. He sat inside the command bunker, surrounded by 3 notebooks filled with crossed-out theories, staring at a conclusion he refused to accept. The radar cross-section is approaching 0, he said quietly. Not reduced, nearly erased. His deputy looked up from the latest damage assessments. That's thermodynamically impossible. Metal reflects electromagnetic radiation. You taught me that. I remember what I taught you, Volkov replied. He pulled out a blank sheet of paper and began drawing aircraft outlines. But what if the aircraft wasn't built like a conventional design at all? What if its structure was deliberately shaped to redirect radar energy away from the transmitting antenna? The aerodynamics would be dreadful. Yes, Volkov said to himself as he continued sketching, adding sharp angles and faceted surfaces. Which means they must have found a way to control the instability. Computers, perhaps, or some form of active flight stabilization. He paused and looked up at his deputy. "This isn't electronic warfare," he said quietly. "This is engineering. They've created something we believed could not be built." 14 years earlier, Clarence Kelly Johnson sat inside a CIA conference room in Langley, Virginia, studying a set of requirements that violated nearly every aircraft design principle he had learned over 3 decades. It was May 1958. Richard Bissell of the CIA slid a classified document across the table. "Impossible isn't written anywhere in the specifications," Bissell said. Johnson had already built the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft for Bissell 3 years earlier, a machine that could fly above 70,000 feet, safely out of reach of Soviet missiles. It worked until it didn't. 2 months earlier, Francis Gary Powers had been shot down over Sverdlovsk, proving that altitude alone no longer guaranteed invisibility. The Soviets had improved their air defenses. The CIA needed a new solution. Johnson returned to Lockheed's Skunk Works facility in Burbank, California, shut the door to his office, and surrounded himself with engineering textbooks and endless coffee. His team had mastered speed with the State Route 71, using sheer velocity to outrun missiles. But speed generated heat, and heat produced enormous infrared signatures. Speed was not stealth. To move forward, Johnson needed to understand radar, not just how it was used, but how it functioned at the most basic physical level. He called in Ed Lovick, his radar specialist. "Ed," Johnson said, "explain radar cross-section to me from the ground up." Lovick brought a blackboard. "Radar waves strike the aircraft and scatter," he explained. "Some of that energy returns to the receiver. The amount that comes back defines the radar cross-section. More reflected energy means a larger signature." Johnson nodded. "Then we reduce the reflection." "Exactly. Either absorb the energy or redirect it," Lovick said, sketching wave paths on the board. "Absorption means specialized materials, costly, heavy, and only partially effective. Deflection depends on geometry. But aircraft are built with curves. Fuselages, wings, canopies. Curved surfaces are terrible for redirection. They scatter radar energy in every direction, and some of it always returns to the transmitter." Johnson studied the wave diagrams in silence. What if there were no curves at all? Lovick looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Flat planes, sharp angles, faceted surfaces." Johnson grabbed the chalk and drew a rough diamond outline. What if the entire aircraft were made from flat panels set at carefully chosen angles? Radar energy strikes a surface and reflects away along a predictable path, never back toward the radar source. Lovick examined the drawing. "That isn't an airplane," he said. "That's a geometric disaster. Would it work? In theory, maybe. But Kelly, it wouldn't fly. Aerodynamic lift depends on curved airfoil shapes. You can't get stable flight from flat plates at odd angles." Johnson added more lines, refining the sketch. "Then we won't rely on natural stability. We'll fly it with computers, active control systems. The aircraft will want to tumble. Fine. We'll use flight computers to make thousands of micro-corrections every second to keep it stable." "That technology doesn't exist," Lovick said. "It will," Johnson replied. He wrote a label beneath the drawing. "Hopeless Diamond," the sarcastic nickname his engineers gave the concept. "Find me a mathematician," Johnson said. "Someone who can calculate exactly how electromagnetic waves behave when they strike angled surfaces." Lockheed hired Bill Schroeder, a gifted mathematician who had published influential work on electromagnetic scattering. Schroeder spent 6 months developing equations that could predict radar reflections based solely on surface geometry. The math confirmed Johnson's intuition. Faceted shapes could reduce radar cross-section by orders of magnitude, but only if every angle was calculated with extreme precision. In 1959, the first scale models were tested inside Lockheed's radar range. A wooden mock-up, coated with radar-absorbing material and mounted on a pole, was bombarded with electromagnetic radiation. Schroeder's equations predicted a 90% reduction in radar return compared to conventional aircraft. The measurements showed 95%. Johnson stood inside the test range, staring at the printout in his hands. His hands shook slightly. He was 50 years old, had designed 14 aircraft, and had just demonstrated that radar invisibility was not a fantasy. It wasn't magic. It was engineering. He returned to his office and called Richard Bissell. "We can build it," Johnson said, "but it won't resemble anything you've ever seen. It will fly like a brick, and it will take at least 10 years before it's operational." Bissell didn't hesitate. "Then begin." Johnson gathered his team inside the secure Skunk Works hangar and revealed the Hopeless Diamond mock-up. His chief aerodynamicist, Dick Cantrell, walked around it twice in silence. "Kelly," he finally said, "this thing has the aerodynamic grace of a falling anvil. I don't dispute the radar reduction. It's extraordinary. But we can't build a reconnaissance aircraft that barely maneuvers, struggles to stay stable, and needs a runway the length of California just to land." Johnson gestured to the sharply angled surfaces. "Every panel is aligned to redirect radar energy. Bill's equations prove it, and the measurements confirm it. 95% reduction. The Soviets won't detect it until it's directly overhead." "If it ever gets overhead," Cantrell replied, "the lift-to-drag ratio is awful. The center of pressure shifts constantly with angle of attack. Miss the optimal angle by a single degree, and the aircraft departs control flight. Then we don't allow it to miss by a degree." Johnson spread flight control schematics across the workbench. "Honeywell is developing digital flight control computers for the lunar module. We adapt that technology. 3 independent computers making continuous corrections. The pilot gives high-level commands, climb, bank, descend, and the system decides which control surfaces move and by how much." Cantrell studied the diagrams. "You're asking a computer to do what human reflexes cannot. Keep an inherently unstable airframe under control." "Exactly," Johnson said. "Human reaction time is about 200 milliseconds. The computer responds in 10, 20 times faster." He pulled out wind tunnel data. "We've logged 4,000 hours of testing. The shape works, only if the flight control system never fails. If it does, the aircraft tumbles and the pilot ejects. That's why we're building redundancy. 2 independent systems with automatic switchover." At that moment, Bill Schroeder stepped in, carrying updated calculations. Schroeder's radar cross-section models grew increasingly advanced, incorporating variations in radar band, polarization, and viewing angles. "Kelly, I've refined the geometry," he said. "If we adjust the fuselage facets by 2.3 degrees, we can cut the radar return by another 30%. Johnson studied the figures. "That will change aerodynamics." "It will destroy them," Cantrell cut in. "We're already operating at the very edge of controllability." Schroeder spread out his electromagnetic scattering charts. "But it makes the aircraft nearly invisible to S-band radar, the primary Soviet early warning frequency. From certain aspects, the return drops below 1 square meter. That's smaller than a bird." Johnson made the choice that would define his legacy. "We optimize for stealth. We'll solve the flight problems with computers and pilot skill." For the next 18 months, the engineering team turned equations into metal. The airframe demanded unconventional materials, an aluminum honeycomb core bonded composite outer layers, machined with extreme precision to preserve exact angles. A single panel misaligned by just 2 millimeters could create a radar hotspot capable of compromising the entire aircraft. The radar-absorbing coating proved just as problematic. The so-called iron ball paint, microscopic iron spheres suspended in polyurethane, absorbed specific radar frequencies, but added weight and required constant upkeep. Ed Lovick's team tested 67 formulations before settling on one that balanced absorption, mass, and durability. In 1977, the first prototype rolled out of the hangar. Lockheed gave it a deliberately bland designation, Have Blue, a name that concealed the radical nature of its design. The aircraft looked otherworldly. Flat panels met at sharp angles. No curves anywhere. The cockpit canopy was planar, tilted precisely to deflect radar energy. Even the engine intakes were shielded by metal grids to obscure the turbine blades from radar exposure. Test pilot Bill Park climbed into the cockpit for the maiden flight at Groom Lake, Nevada. The remote test site, Area 51, along with strict classification protocols, ensured isolation from Soviet satellites and unwanted eyes. Johnson watched from the control tower as Park brought the engines to life. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, its sharp-edged silhouette violating every visual convention of airplane design. Then it left the ground. The flight control computers held it steady. Park climbed to 10,000 feet, completed a 15-minute test sequence, and returned for a clean landing. Johnson allowed himself a brief smile. Physics had not compromised. Engineering had prevailed. The Have-Blue prototype had validated the idea. What remained was the far more difficult task of transforming a delicate experimental aircraft into a combat-ready machine. The Air Force wanted an attack platform, not a reconnaissance vehicle, something capable of penetrating Soviet air defenses, striking high-value targets, and returning home. Lockheed designated the operational version the F-117A Nighthawk. The name itself was intentional misdirection. The F fighter prefix instead of A for attack, chosen to confuse Soviet intelligence analysts who might intercept references to the program. Operational demands introduced new layers of complexity. Have-Blue carried no weapons. The F-117 required an internal bomb bay large enough to hold 2 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs, while preserving strict radar signature control. Opening the bay doors during weapons release created brief radar spikes, short windows of visibility that enemy operators might exploit. Alan Brown, head of weapons integration, solved the problem with geometry. The doors are faceted like the rest of the aircraft, he explained. When they open, the angles still redirect most radar energy. We limit door open time to 15 seconds, just long enough to release the weapons and close again. The production aircraft grew larger than Have-Blue, 62 feet long with a 43-foot wingspan, and significantly heavier, with a maximum takeoff weight of 52,500 pounds. 2 General Electric F404 engines were buried deep within the fuselage. Their infrared signatures were reduced through exhaust mixing systems that cooled the hot gases before venting them through flat slots rather than traditional round nozzles. Test pilot Hal Farley flew the first production F-117 in June 1981. His classified flight report contained a single sentence, one that justified 5 years of relentless engineering. Radar testing confirmed an effective cross-section of less than 0.01 square meters at optimal angles, comparable to that of a hummingbird. The Air Force ultimately produced 59 F-117 aircraft under conditions of extreme secrecy. At a unit cost of $43 million, they were expensive, but far less costly than losing conventional bombers to Soviet surface-to-air missiles. Production at the Burbank facility operated behind layers of cover stories. Workers told their families they were assembling ordinary aircraft components. Security clearances were divided into 4 separate tiers. No one outside the compartmentalized program understood the true purpose of the angular black aircraft. Pilot training took place exclusively at night at the Tonopah Test Range in Nevada. The pilots of the 4,450th Tactical Group learned to operate an aircraft unlike anything they had flown before. The faceted design produced erratic airflow patterns. Although the flight control computers compensated for the instability, pilots still had to relearn how to fly. Major Alton Whitley, one of the first operational pilots, summed up the challenge. You don't fly the F-117. You tell it where you want to go and trust the computers to take you there. Try to manhandle it like an F-4 and it will depart controlled flight instantly. It demands smooth inputs, patience, and complete faith in the automation. The aircraft had clear limitations. It was strictly subsonic. High speed increased radar visibility. It had no air-to-air roll. The stealth geometry could not support external weapons. It carried no onboard radar, since emitting electromagnetic energy would reveal its position. Instead, pilots relied on infrared targeting systems and mission routes programmed before takeoff. But within those constraints, within those limits, the F-17 achieved something no other aircraft could. It moved through heavily defended airspace, as though the defenses simply weren't there. Soviet radar screens showed nothing. Infrared systems found no heat signature. Acoustic sensors might register a soft murmur from the turbofan engines, but by that moment, the weapons were already on their way down. Kelly Johnson retired from Lockheed in 1975, years before the F-17 ever flew. Yet the aircraft bore his unmistakable imprint. His relentless obsession with reducing radar cross-section, his readiness to abandon traditional aerodynamic principles in favor of stealth, and his demand for extreme manufacturing precision all came together in a fleet of 59 matte black aircraft that permanently changed aerial warfare. The Soviet Union, despite Colonel Volkov's increasingly advanced theories, never uncovered the program. They knew something was striking targets across multiple regions. They simply couldn't identify what. American stealth technology remained the most closely guarded military secret of the Cold War's final years, until it was finally used in combat, removing any remaining doubt. The Pentagon's push toward operational stealth aircraft hardened after April 24, 1980, in the Iranian desert. Operation Eagle Claw, the attempt to rescue American hostages in Tehran, ended in disaster when a helicopter collided with AC-130 during extraction. 8 servicemen were killed in the resulting fire. The surviving aircraft withdrew, and the mission was abandoned. In the White House Situation Room, President Carter's military advisors conducted a blunt postmortem. The core failure was obvious. Conventional aircraft could not penetrate defended airspace without enormous support. Eagle Claw had required 8 helicopters, 6 transport aircraft, and complex diversionary plans. Despite all that coordination, the force never even reached Tehran. Colonel James Allen of the Tactical Requirements Division put the conclusion into a classified memo that soon crossed every senior officer's desk. The United States needed an aircraft that could operate without escorts, without diversions, without elaborate choreography. An aircraft that could fly alone, strike with precision, and disappear before anyone realized it had been there. The F-17 program, still deeply classified, offered precisely the capability Colonel Allen had called for. His assessment pushed the program onto a faster operational track. In October 1981, the Air Force stood up the 4,450th Tactical Group at Tonopah with a narrowly defined mission: precision attacks against high-value, time-critical targets protected by dense air defenses. Pilots trained for missions no conventional aircraft could realistically attempt. Lone aircraft penetrations. No electronic warfare backup. No fighter cover. No jamming platforms. Just a single F-17, 1 pilot, 2 bombs, and pre-programmed target data. Major Jerry Leatherman flew some of the earliest training sorties. The scenarios were stark. A chemical weapons facility deep inside hostile territory, shielded by Soviet-designed surface-to-air missile systems. The task was simple in description and brutal in execution. Pass through the defenses, destroy the primary structure, and exit without ever being detected. Mission preparation was meticulous. Crews spent hours poring over satellite imagery, isolating precise aim points, calculating wind effects, and designing ingress routes that minimize exposure time, even though enemy radar was effectively blind to them. Every variable was examined, every margin refined. As training progressed, the scenarios became increasingly demanding. Multiple targets in a single sortie. Attacks conducted through poor weather. Precision strikes that required weapon impact within 3 meters of the designated point. Laser-guided bombs could deliver that level of accuracy, but only if the pilot maintained perfectly stable flight during the final guidance phase. No evasive action. No defensive maneuvering. Just straight and level flight, trusting invisibility while moving through hostile airspace. The psychological conditioning proved as critical as the technical training. Traditional pilots depended on constant situational awareness, radio updates from AWACS, missile warning tones, threat displays. F-17 pilots operated in complete radio silence, deep inside defended territory, with no external cues of danger. They relied entirely on the stealth itself. One pilot later described it as faith-based flying. You either trusted the physics completely, or you had no place in the cockpit. The 4,450th rehearsed every link in the strike process. Intelligence teams built detailed target folders. Planners refined timelines down to seconds. Every mission was treated as a closed system, planned, executed, and exited with no margin for improvisation. Intelligence teams pinpointed high-value, high-risk targets. Ordnance specialists matched each objective with the most effective weapons. Pilots flew their mission profiles at night to mirror real combat conditions. On the ground, maintenance crews worked obsessively to preserve the aircraft's stealth surfaces. Even minor damage or contamination could create radar reflections that undermined invisibility. By 1983, the unit had reached full operational readiness. The aircraft performed as designed. The pilots were qualified. The logistical and support systems were in place. Yet the F-17 remained hidden from the world. Employing it in combat would expose its existence and risk eroding a critical technological edge. As a result, the Pentagon imposed strict rules for its use. F-17s would be committed only when conventional aircraft could not complete the mission, when the value of the target justified revealing the capability, or when national security required absolute certainty of success. For the next 8 years, the 4,450th Tactical Group flew training sorties over Nevada, waiting for a mission that met those conditions. Air crews kept their skills sharp. The aircraft stayed mission-ready. And within classified Pentagon archives, analysts continued to examine past bombing campaigns, searching for insights into how aircraft that could not be seen might have altered history. One case study surfaced repeatedly in those evaluations. Operation Linebacker 2, December 1972, North Vietnam. In 1985, 13 years after B-52s had pounded North Vietnamese targets during President Nixon's Christmas bombing campaign, the Pentagon's Historical Analysis Division reopened the Linebacker 2 files. The official after-action reports recorded 729 sorties, the loss of 15 B-52 bombers, and the destruction of strategic targets across the Hanoi-Haiphong corridor. Loss rates were considered acceptable given the density of the air defenses. But hidden within classified annexes, analysts uncovered a very different picture. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Harding was placed in charge of the stealth employment study. Her team was tasked with identifying historical operations where low observable aircraft could have produced decisive advantages. She accessed restricted Defense Intelligence Agency archives, intercepted North Vietnamese air defense communications, Soviet technical evaluations, and debriefings from returning American prisoners of war. A recurring pattern surfaced in the final weeks of 1972. North Vietnamese Air Defense Coordination Centers logged a series of unusual strike reports. Targets were hit with high accuracy, yet radar showed no contacts and no attacking aircraft were visually confirmed. At the time, these incidents had been written off as equipment malfunctions or operator mistakes. Lieutenant Colonel Harding revisited those reports and compared them against U.S. operational records. What she uncovered prompted a request for additional classified files. In late 1972, a small experimental detachment had been operating out of Thailand, flying modified A-7 Corsair II aircraft. These planes have been treated with radar-absorbing materials and structural changes designed to lower their radar cross-section. The effort was not true stealth. The modifications reduced radar visibility by only 30 to 40%. But under certain conditions, that reduction was sufficient to disrupt North Vietnamese detection systems. The program, known as Compass Ghost, was intended as a proof of concept for reduced radar signature technology. Harding obtained the Compass Ghost mission records. From November through December 1972, the modified A-7s flew 47 sorties against heavily defended targets in North Vietnam. These missions were deliberately structured to evaluate which flight paths, altitudes, and attack angles caused the greatest breakdowns in enemy air defense coordination. The results were striking. When the modified aircraft attacked at night from medium altitude, North Vietnamese radar operators frequently failed to establish tracking solutions. The reduced radar return fell below the thresholds that triggered automated warning systems. By the time operators detected the aircraft manually, weapons had already been released and the attackers were exiting the area. Even more significant was the psychological impact. A classified CIA assessment from 1973, later obtained to a defecting North Vietnamese intelligence officer, described the effect on air defense crews. Personnel suffered severe declines in morale when they could not detect incoming aircraft. Their training had taught them that correct radar operation guaranteed detection. When detection failed despite proper procedures, crews began to question their equipment, their training, and ultimately their ability to protect key targets. Harding's team rebuilt the tactical picture from the ground up. The Compass Ghost trials have been narrow in scope. Only partial reductions in radar signature, only specific attack geometries, and only a limited number of missions. Yet they revealed a critical insight. Lowering detectability produced cascading effects that went far beyond simply slipping through defenses. It disrupted coordination across air defense networks, eroded operator confidence, and forced offenders to question the validity of their entire tactical framework. Her classified study ended with a clear conclusion. If a 40% reduction in radar cross-section had generated measurable breakdowns in defensive effectiveness in 1972, then an aircraft achieving a 99% reduction, such as the F-17, would render conventional air defense systems largely ineffective. In 1972, North Vietnamese radar crews had encountered the earliest manifestation of stealth technology. They could not explain what they were experiencing because they lacked the conceptual tools to understand it. The phenomenon existed outside their doctrinal vocabulary. The report eventually reached the desk of Air Force Chief of Staff General Larry Welch. He read it twice before requesting a direct briefing from the F-17 program office. During that session, Welch posed a blunt question. The North Vietnamese were frightened by aircraft they could barely see. What happens when we arrive with aircraft they cannot see at all? The answer would emerge 9 years later over the skies of Baghdad. But the North Vietnamese defenders had unknowingly served as the first test subjects. Their fear was preserved in intercepted communications and intelligence summaries, evidence that stealth technology did more than evade radar. It undermined the psychological foundation upon which air defense systems depended. January 17, 1991. Baghdad's integrated air defense network was the most advanced in the world outside the Soviet Union. It consisted of a French-designed command and control architecture linking more than 7,000 radar sites, command centers fusing data from overlapping coverage zones, and roughly 3,000 anti-aircraft guns supported by an estimated 16,000 surface-to-air missiles. Iraqi commanders had studied the Vietnam War in detail. They believed they had learned from North Vietnam's failures. Their air defense crews trained continuously. Their systems were modern, carefully maintained, and calibrated to NATO standards. At 2:38 hours, 10 F-117 Nighthawks crossed into Iraqi airspace. There was no electronic jamming support, no fighter escort, no diversionary strikes. Just 10 angular, black aircraft carrying precision-guided weapons toward the most heavily defended targets in the country: communications hubs, air defense headquarters, and hardened command bunkers. Inside Iraqi control rooms, radar operators stare at screens showing nothing but empty sky. The Carry Integrated Air Defense Network processed data from multiple radar sites and found no contacts. Missile battery commanders searched infrared bands and detected no heat signatures. A system that cost billions of dollars in years to construct reported a perfectly clean threat picture. At 2:51 hours, Baghdad's main telecommunications center erupted in flames. Moments later, the Air Defense Operations Center was hit, then 3 command bunkers. In just 8 minutes, 10 targets were struck, 10 direct hits. Iraqi air defense crews attempted to respond, launching missiles at threats they could not detect, could not track, and could not engage. The system simply had nothing to shoot at. Captain Marcel Curavad, flying F-117 callsign number 816, later described the experience. Their radars were active. We could see their emissions clearly on our threat displays. Their missile batteries were armed and ready, but they were searching empty air. During my attack run, I flew directly over 3 separate surface-to-air missile sites. None of them fired, not because they chose not to, but because they literally could not see me. The psychological effect was immediate and catastrophic. Iraqi operators had trained under the assumption that proper procedures guaranteed detection. That night shattered that belief. The defenses hadn't failed mechanically. They had failed conceptually. They were scanning empty sky. During my attack run, I flew directly over 3 separate SAM sites. None of them fired, not because they held back, but because they literally could not detect me. The psychological effect was immediate and overwhelming. Iraqi crews had trained extensively for American jamming tactics, electronic warfare, and saturation attacks, but they had never trained for invisibility. Within 72 hours, Iraqi air defense personnel began abandoning their posts, not out of fear, but from sheer futility. Their equipment worked flawlessly, yet it detected nothing as their targets erupted around them. Kelly Johnson had passed away in 1990, 1 year before the Gulf War, but the decades-long obsession he had begun in a CIA conference room in 1958 to make aircraft invisible to radar had just proven itself in the most comprehensive way imaginable. Over 43 nights of combat, F-117s flew 1,271 sorties against heavily defended targets. Not a single aircraft was damaged. Not a single pilot was lost. The stealth technology that Lockheed engineers had painstakingly developed over 30 years had performed perfectly. The North Vietnamese in 1972 had only seen the earliest prototype concept. Partially reduced signatures, confused radar operators, unexplained attacks. They had reported their fear and confusion to Soviet advisors, who could not make sense of it. Colonel Volkov's team had even sketched faceted aircraft designs, but dismissed them as unrealistic. The Iraqi defenders in 1991 faced a fully matured version of that technology. No ambiguity, no sense of glitches, just undeniable proof that conventional air defenses were obsolete against aircraft designed from first principles to be invisible. The paradigm had shifted. From that moment onward, every air defense system in the world had to account for the possibility that an attacker might be completely invisible to radar. Nations rushed to develop counter-stealth measures, but the laws of physics themselves had not changed. Electromagnetic waves follow consistent, predictable rules, and Kelly Johnson's team had learned to manipulate their reflection and deflection with precise geometry. The fear that gripped North Vietnamese radar operators in 1972, watching blank screens as their targets were destroyed, had now become a defining truth of modern aerial combat. This was not the result of magic or science fiction. It was a product of relentless engineering, rigorous mathematics, and a determination of a single, uncompromising aircraft designer who refused to accept that the requirement was impossible until he turned it into operational reality. Physics, as it turned out, could be mastered. You just needed the right equations and 3 decades of obsessive focus.